The morning I finished the fence felt like the end of a long, quiet project. I stood in the backyard for a minute just looking at it. Fresh cedar boards, evenly spaced, the posts set straight in the soil, the line running clean along the edge of my property. It had taken me 3 weekends of digging, measuring, leveling, and setting concrete. Nothing flashy, just solid work done carefully. The sun was still low, lighting the yard in that calm golden color you only get early in the day. The neighborhood was quiet except for sprinklers ticking somewhere down the street. That's when I saw her. Rebecca Langford, the HOA president, marching straight across my lawn. She didn't slow down when she reached the gate. She pushed it open and walked into my yard like it belonged to her. In her hand was a folded sheet of paper, stiff and creased from being opened too many times. The way she held it made it look less like a document and more like evidence. Or a weapon. She stopped about 10 feet from the fence and unfolded the paper with a sharp snap. No greeting, no introduction. No knocking on the door first. She pointed directly at the fence line and said 3 words that started everything. Remove it immediately. For a second I thought she might be joking, but Rebecca Langford didn't look like someone who joked about anything. Her posture was stiff, shoulders squared, the expression on her face that kind of HOA authority people sometimes wear like a badge, the kind that says rules matter more than conversations. I wiped the dust from my hands and walked over slowly. "Morning," I said. She ignored the greeting completely and lifted the paper toward me. "This fence," she said sharply, tapping the map with one finger, "is 2 feet onto HOA common property." I glanced down at the page. It was a subdivision survey map, one of those simplified diagrams developers create when a neighborhood is first built. Straight lines, labeled blots, thin boundary marks, the kind of paper that looks official enough to scare people. She kept talking. "You are not authorized to construct any permanent structure on association land. The board has reviewed the matter, and you are required to remove this fence within 72 hours. 72 hours. She said it like it was a generous favor. "If the fence is not removed," she continued, "daily violation fines will begin immediately." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked at the map again. Years earlier, before I ever moved into this neighborhood, I worked as a survey technician. My job back then had been walking fields and neighborhoods with measuring equipment, locating boundary markers, verifying lot lines. You learn to read these maps quickly, and within about 3 seconds, something felt wrong. Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. The alignment on the diagram didn't match the physical layout of the properties. The angle of the boundary line was off. The reference marker they were using didn't connect correctly with the street coordinates. It was subtle if you didn't know what you were looking at. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. I looked back up at Rebecca. "Where did you get this survey?" I asked calmly. She folded her arms. "It's the official subdivision survey used by the HOA. "That's not a boundary survey," I said. Her expression hardened instantly. "It's more than sufficient for this situation." I glanced at the fence again, then back at the paper. "I'm telling you right now," I said evenly, "this map isn't accurate enough to determine that line." Rebecca gave a short laugh that didn't sound amused. "The board disagrees." Of course they did. People love paperwork when it supports their authority. She pointed toward the fence again. "You have 72 hours, she repeated. I noticed movement across the street. My neighbor, Mark Sullivan, had stepped out onto his driveway. He leaned against his truck pretending to check something on his phone, but his eyes kept drifting toward the yard, watching, waiting, enjoying the show. Rebecca continued speaking like the decision had already been finalized. "If the fence is not removed voluntarily, the association will arrange removal and add the cost to your account." I studied the map one more time. The mistake jumped out even clearer now. And that's when something else clicked in my mind. If this survey was wrong, it didn't just affect my fence. It affected every property connected to that boundary line. Half the neighborhood could be off, but Rebecca Langford wasn't interested in any of that. To her, the paper was already proof. She folded the map again and stepped back toward the gate. 72 hours, she said one last time. Then she walked off my property like the conversation was finished. Across the street, Mark smirked and disappeared back into his garage. I stood there for a moment looking at the fence. 3 weekends of work. Every post placed exactly where the measurements said it should go. And the strange part? I wasn't worried. Because the moment I saw that survey, I knew the truth was already on my side. What Rebecca Langford didn't know yet was that the mistake on that map didn't just affect my yard. It affected half the neighborhood. And the moment the real boundary lines came out, the entire HOA board was going to wish they had never touched my fence. If you enjoy HOA justice stories, subscribe, and let's get into what happened next. Rebecca didn't leave right away. After delivering her warning, she stayed planted in the grass like she expected me to start tearing boards out of the ground on the spot. The folded survey map rested against her hip, her expression calm in that particular way people get when they believe rules automatically make them right. "This isn't complicated," she said, gesturing toward the fence line. "The association owns the land beyond that marker. Your structure crosses into it." I stepped closer and asked if I could see the paper again. She hesitated for a moment but unfolded it. The page was a basic subdivision diagram printed years ago. Lot numbers, simplified property outlines, a few coordinate references near the street corners. It was the kind of document developers often include in neighborhood packets when homes are first sold, but it wasn't what she thought it was. I studied the lines quietly. The boundary she was pointing to wasn't anchored to any confirmed survey monuments. The scale on the page was rough. The reference point she kept tapping was based on an estimated corner marker that likely hadn't been verified since the houses were built. In other words, it looked official, but it wasn't precise. I handed the map back to her. "This isn't a boundary survey," I said calmly. Rebecca frowned slightly. "It's the official subdivision map." "Right," I said. "But that's not the same thing." Her posture stiffened. I pointed gently toward the corner of the page. "This type of map shows general lot layouts. It's not meant to determine exact property lines down to a couple feet. For that, you need a certified survey done by a licensed surveyor." Rebecca's expression didn't change. "The board has already reviewed the matter." I nodded slowly. "That may be, but this document alone can't prove the fence crosses onto HOA land." Across the street, I could see Mark Sullivan shifting his weight beside his truck. He had stopped pretending to check his phone now. He was watching the conversation openly, arms folded, the hint of a grin sitting comfortably on his face. It wasn't hard to guess who had reported the fence. Rebecca continued speaking as if the technical details didn't matter. "The association enforces property compliance based on the subdivision plan. Every homeowner in this neighborhood agreed to those rules when they purchased their property." "I understand the rules," I said. "I'm not disputing them." "Then remove the fence." I shook my head gently. "I'm saying the map you're using isn't accurate enough to make that decision." Rebecca looked irritated now. "The board disagrees with your opinion." I kept my voice steady. "It's not really an opinion. Without a certified survey, no one can say exactly where that line is." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you refusing to comply with the violation notice?" I glanced once more at the fence stretching cleanly across the yard. "I'm refusing to remove it based on an unverified map," I said. "If the association wants to confirm the boundary with a licensed surveyor, I'll respect whatever the results show." That seemed to irritate her even more. The situation was no longer simple authority versus compliance. Now it involved verification, process, and accuracy. Things that slow down quick decisions. Rebecca folded the survey paper again with sharp movements. "The board has already approved enforcement," she said. "Your refusal will result in fines." I nodded. "I figured that might happen." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised by the lack of panic. Across the street, Mark chuckled under his breath. Rebecca looked between the fence and the folded paper as if expecting the structure to disappear out of fear alone. Then she stepped toward the gate. "Very well," she said. "If you won't remove it voluntarily, the board will handle it." She paused for emphasis. 72 hours. With that, she walked out of the yard and closed the gate behind her. Mark pushed himself off his truck and walked back toward his garage, clearly satisfied with how things had gone. I stayed where I was for a minute, looking again at the fence line. The boards were straight. The measurements were right. And more importantly, the map she had shown me confirmed something else. If the HOA had been relying on that document to enforce boundaries, they might have been making decisions based on guesses. I went back inside the house without touching a single board of the fence. The next morning, I opened the front door and immediately saw the paper taped to it, bright yellow. Violation notice. It flapped slightly in the breeze as I peeled it off. The message was short and direct. Unauthorized structure on HOA property. Fence must be removed immediately. Daily fines will begin until the violation is corrected. The first fine had already been applied. Rebecca Langford clearly didn't believe in waiting. I read through the notice once and set it on the kitchen counter. Then I opened my laptop. The HOA community forum was already buzzing. Rebecca had posted a message late the night before describing the situation. Homeowner at Lot 23 has constructed a fence 2 feet onto HOA land and has refused to comply with removal instructions. That was the headline. Below it, she warned residents that unauthorized land use could impact community property and association rules. It didn't take long for the comments to appear. Some neighbors expressed concern about rule violations. Others simply assumed the board had the facts. A few people speculated that I had knowingly built onto shared land. From their perspective, the situation looked simple: fence built in the wrong place. Homeowner refusing to fix it. But speculation didn't bother me. Instead of replying to the discussion, I closed the forum entirely. Arguing online rarely fixes anything. Facts do. I picked up my phone and searched for the county survey office. After a few minutes, I reached someone at the front desk and asked to speak with a technician. A man answered a moment later. I introduced myself and asked a simple question. Has anyone verified the original subdivision boundary markers in our neighborhood recently? There was a pause while he checked something on his end. Then he came back on the line. Not that I can see. How long has it been? More typing. Looks like the last recorded verification was during the initial development survey. I leaned back in the chair. And when was that? About 22 years ago. 22 years. I thanked him and hung up. That answer told me everything I needed to know. Because if no one had confirmed the original markers in more than 2 decades, there was a very good chance the lines Rebecca Langford believed in weren't exactly where she thought they were. 2 days passed quietly after the notice appeared on my door. I didn't remove the fence. I didn't respond on the HOA forum. I didn't argue with anyone. Instead, I spent the time making a few phone calls, organizing paperwork, and confirming something I had already suspected the moment I saw Rebecca's map. By the 3rd morning, the neighborhood was just starting to wake up when I heard the sound of a truck slowing down outside the house. A large white pickup pulled to the curb in front of my property. The logo on the side door read, Summit Property Services. Behind it, a small flatbed trailer carried a stack of tools and equipment: post pullers, cutting saws, shovels. 2 men stepped out of the truck and looked toward the fence. One of them pointed down the property line, clearly identifying the structure they had come for. So, Rebecca wasn't bluffing. She had actually hired contractors to remove the fence. I watched through the front window for a moment before grabbing the folder I had prepared earlier that morning. Inside were a few printed documents, notes from the county office, and the appointment confirmation I had received the night before. By the time I stepped outside, the 2 workers had already walked through the gate and were studying the fence posts. "Morning," I said. They turned around. "Morning," the older one replied. "You the homeowner?" "I am." He nodded toward the truck. "We were hired by the Homeowners Association to remove a fence structure that's encroaching onto community property." His tone was professional. Not aggressive, not apologetic, just a man explaining the job he'd been assigned. I held up the folder slightly. "You guys might want to hold off a bit." The 2 workers exchanged a glance. Before either of them could respond, another vehicle pulled up along the curb. Rebecca Langford stepped out of her SUV and walked quickly across the lawn. She looked immediately toward the fence, and then toward me. Her expression darkened the moment she realized nothing had changed. The fence still stood exactly where it had been 2 days earlier. "You were instructed to remove that structure," she said sharply. Her voice carried across the yard loud enough that a couple of nearby doors opened down the street. "I was instructed," I said calmly. She gestured toward the contractors. "The association has authorized removal." One of the workers shifted awkwardly, clearly aware the situation was becoming something more than a simple job. Rebecca continued speaking like the outcome was already decided. "The cost of removal will be billed directly to your account, along with the violation fines." I didn't raise my voice, didn't argue. Instead, I opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "I figured that might happen," I said. She glanced at the page in my hand but didn't bother stepping closer to read it. "Your refusal to comply doesn't change the property boundary," she replied. "I agree," I said. That made her pause slightly. "I'm not trying to change the boundary." She frowned. "Then why is the fence still here?" I handed the document to the older contractor first. He scanned it briefly. "What's this?" he asked. "Survey confirmation," I said. Rebecca crossed her arms. "Survey confirmation for what?" I looked directly at her. "For an official county boundary survey." The workers both looked up now. "It's scheduled for this afternoon," I continued. "Licensed county surveyor will be here with equipment to verify the property markers." Rebecca blinked once. Then she laughed. Not amused. More like someone dismissing something they didn't want to hear. "You think scheduling a survey changes anything?" "No," I said calmly. "It just confirms where the line actually is." She turned toward the contractors again. "Start with the panels along the north side," she instructed. The two workers hesitated. The older one glanced back at the paper he was holding. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "if there's an active boundary survey happening today, it might be better to wait until—" Rebecca cut him off. "The HOA survey already confirmed the line." I spoke before the workers had to answer. "That's not a survey." Rebecca turned toward me again, clearly irritated now. "It's the official subdivision map." "Right," I said. "And if that map turns out to be wrong?" I paused for a moment. Not for drama. Just to make sure the words landed clearly. "If that survey is wrong," I continued, "this fence isn't the problem." Rebecca stared at me. "What does that even mean?" I gestured toward the neighborhood behind her. "The entire HOA boundary is." The yard went quiet. Even the contractors stopped moving. Rebecca looked confused at first, then slightly uncertain, because the implication had just settled in. If the line on that map wasn't accurate, then every decision the HOA had made based on it could be wrong too. Not just my fence. Driveways, garages, walkways, community land. All of it. One of the workers slowly folded the paper I had given him. "You sure the surveyor's coming today?" he asked. 2 o'clock, I said. He nodded and looked toward his partner. Rebecca remained standing near the gate, her arms still crossed, but her confidence no longer quite as solid as when she first arrived. For the first time since this whole situation started, she wasn't completely sure she was right. The afternoon arrived slowly. By early afternoon, word had already spread through the neighborhood that something was happening at my property. A few people were outside pretending to water plants or check mail, but their eyes kept drifting toward the fence line. At exactly 2 o'clock, a white county utility truck rolled down the street and stopped in front of the house. The door opened and a tall man stepped out carrying a long tripod and a bright yellow instrument case. Thomas Green, licensed county surveyor. He walked toward the yard with the calm, methodical pace of someone who had spent years doing the same precise work. His truck logo identified him clearly, County Land Survey Division. Rebecca Langford was already standing near the sidewalk when he arrived. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, posture stiff with the quiet confidence she had carried since the beginning of the dispute. To her, the afternoon was simply a formality, a confirmation of what she already believed to be true. Thomas greeted both of us with a brief nod. "Afternoon," he said. "I understand there's a boundary concern." Rebecca spoke first. "Yes," she said firmly. "This homeowner constructed a fence 2 feet onto association land." She held up the folded subdivision map again. "This survey confirms it." Thomas accepted the paper and studied it briefly. He didn't say anything at first. He simply folded the map again and handed it back. "That's a development diagram," he said evenly, "not a boundary survey." Rebecca didn't respond. Instead, she gestured toward the fence as if the answer was obvious. Thomas walked toward the edge of the yard and began unloading equipment from his truck. Within a few minutes, the tripod was standing firmly in the grass. The yellow survey instrument sat on top, slowly rotating as he calibrated the device. Then he began placing bright orange marker flags along the ground, one near the sidewalk, another near the corner of the yard, a third near the rear fence line. Each flag marked a measurement point. As he worked, more neighbors slowly gathered outside. A few stood on driveways. Others leaned casually against parked cars. Curiosity travels fast in quiet neighborhoods. Mark Sullivan appeared near the end of his driveway again, arms crossed, watching the process unfold. Rebecca remained near the sidewalk, standing perfectly still. The confidence on her face hadn't changed yet. Thomas moved carefully between markers, checking coordinates and distances through the instrument lens. Every few minutes he wrote something on a small clipboard before adjusting another measurement. The process looked slow, deliberate, precise. Nothing about it resembled the quick certainty of the paper Rebecca had been carrying around. After about 20 minutes, Thomas walked to the far edge of the yard near the corner where my property met Mark's. He crouched down near a small metal cap buried almost level with the soil. He brushed the dirt away and exposed the marker, one of the original subdivision boundary pins. He measured the coordinates. Then he looked through the instrument again toward the opposite corner. His brow tightened slightly. He checked the reading again. Then he walked back toward the tripod and adjusted the angle. Another measurement. Another note on the clipboard. Rebecca shifted her weight slightly but said nothing. Thomas moved toward the sidewalk again and located another metal marker near the curb. After brushing the dirt away, he repeated the process. The instrument rotated slowly as he aligned the readings. Then he stopped moving. For a moment, he simply stared through the lens again. His expression had changed. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed it. He checked the numbers again, then once more. Rebecca finally spoke. "Well?" she asked. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked back toward the first marker near the fence line and remeasured the distance. Another number went onto the clipboard. The quiet crowd along the street had grown larger now. People could sense something interesting was happening. Thomas finally stood upright and turned toward Rebecca. "The boundary alignment on your subdivision map is off," he said calmly. Rebecca frowned. "That's impossible." Thomas held up the clipboard slightly. "The original survey markers are still here," he explained. "They're consistent with county records." He gestured toward the orange flags now scattered across the yard. "But the diagram your association has been referencing isn't aligned to those markers." Rebecca shook her head. "That map has been used for years." Thomas nodded. "That doesn't make it correct." The neighbors along the street leaned forward slightly. Rebecca stepped closer. "How far off could it possibly be?" Thomas glanced down at his notes again, then back at the fence. "Just under 6 feet, he said. The words hung in the air for a moment. 6 feet. Rebecca blinked. "That can't be right." Thomas pointed toward the fence line. "The actual property boundary runs approximately here." He stepped forward and placed a bright orange marker nearly 6 feet away from where Rebecca had insisted the line was, which meant one thing. The fence wasn't 2 feet onto HOA land. It wasn't even close. It was completely inside my property. Rebecca stared at the marker like it had appeared out of nowhere. For the first time since she walked into my yard days earlier, the certainty on her face disappeared. And around us, the quiet neighborhood suddenly felt a lot less certain about the HOA's authority than it had that morning. For a few seconds after Thomas placed the orange marker, no one spoke. The small flag stood in the grass like a quiet announcement. It was nearly 6 feet away from where Rebecca had been pointing the entire time. 6 feet. That was the distance between certainty and reality. Rebecca stared at the marker as if it might move if she looked long enough. "That can't be correct," she said again, though her voice was softer now. Thomas didn't react to the doubt. He simply turned his clipboard toward her so she could see the measurements written across the page. These readings are based on the original subdivision markers, he explained calmly. Those metal pins were placed during the first development survey and recorded with the county. He pointed toward the small metal cap he had uncovered earlier near the corner of the yard. They're still in the same positions today. Rebecca looked down at the numbers but didn't say anything. Thomas continued. The diagram your HOA has been referencing appears to have been redrawn later, probably for planning purposes. But whoever recreated it didn't align the boundary coordinates correctly. Rebecca's eyes moved slowly across the yard, then back to the fence. But the fence, it crosses the line on our map. Thomas nodded once. Yes. He paused for a moment before finishing the thought. Your map is wrong. The words settled heavily in the quiet afternoon air. A murmur moved through the small group of neighbors gathered near the curb. Someone whispered something to the person beside them. Rebecca straightened her posture, as if trying to push the moment away. This only affects this lot, she said quickly. Thomas didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked several steps toward the edge of Mark Sullivan's driveway and studied another orange marker he had placed there earlier. He measured the distance again and then looked back toward the crowd. No, he said calmly. It doesn't. Rebecca frowned. What do you mean? Thomas gestured toward the entire row of houses along the street. If the diagram your HOA uses is misaligned by this much, he explained, then every property tied to that boundary line is affected. Several neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Thomas walked a few steps farther down the edge of the sidewalk and pointed toward the concrete path that curved through the small green space between houses. The HOA walking path. This path, he said, appears to have been built according to the incorrect diagram. Rebecca followed his gesture slowly. The actual property line runs about 5 to 6 feet farther over. A man standing near the curb frowned. You're saying the path isn't on HOA land? Thomas looked at his notes again. Not entirely. He gestured again with the clipboard. Parts of it cross into private property. Another quiet ripple of voices spread through the group. Rebecca turned sharply toward the houses across the street. That's impossible, she said. But Thomas was already walking toward the far corner of Mark Sullivan's property. He stopped near the edge of the driveway where Mark's detached garage sat just a few feet from the boundary line. Thomas placed another orange marker beside the structure. Then he stepped back and studied the distance. Mark had been watching quietly from his driveway since the survey began. Now he stepped forward. What does that mean? He asked. Thomas pointed at the marker near the garage. Based on the original boundary markers, he said carefully, the corner of this structure extends several feet beyond the property line. Mark blinked. Beyond whose property line? Thomas gestured toward the yard beside it. Your neighbors. The crowd went silent again. The same neighbor who had just been watching the whole situation unfold. Me. Mark looked toward the garage as if seeing it for the first time. Then he looked back at Rebecca. Her face had gone noticeably pale. Because in that moment, she understood something far worse than the fence dispute. For years, the HOA had been enforcing property boundaries using a diagram that didn't match the real survey markers. Fines, warnings, violation notices, all based on measurements that were wrong. The fence I had built? It wasn't 2 feet onto HOA land. It wasn't even close. It sat comfortably within my property line, exactly where it should have been the entire time. Rebecca looked back toward Thomas. You're saying the association has been enforcing the wrong boundaries? Thomas didn't soften the answer. It appears so. A few neighbors immediately stepped away from the curb and began walking slowly toward their own yards, eyes scanning the ground as if hidden boundary lines might suddenly become visible. Others began quietly discussing their own fences, sheds, and driveways. If the HOA map was off by 6 feet, how many other properties were affected? Rebecca remained standing near the gate, gripping the folded subdivision map tightly in her hand. The document that had looked so powerful 2 days earlier now seemed small, almost meaningless. Around her, the neighborhood had started changing. People weren't watching the fence anymore. They were looking at their own property lines and asking questions the HOA had never expected them to ask. 3 nights after the survey, the HOA clubhouse was more crowded than anyone had seen it in years. Normally, the monthly meetings were quiet. A handful of residents, a few board members, some routine discussion about landscaping budgets or neighborhood rules. Most people preferred to stay home, unless something directly affected them. This meeting was different. Every folding chair in the room was filled. Several residents stood along the walls. Others leaned against the back counters with their arms crossed, waiting. Word about the survey had spread to the neighborhood faster than anyone expected. And people had questions. Rebecca Langford sat at the front table with the rest of the HOA board. The same subdivision map that had started the entire conflict rested neatly beside her stack of papers. But now, instead of confidence, there was tension in the room. She tapped the microphone lightly. "Thank you all for attending tonight's emergency meeting," she began, her voice carefully measured. "We are here to clarify a misunderstanding regarding property boundaries that occurred earlier this week." A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. Rebecca continued speaking. "The association has relied on the subdivision diagram provided during development, which has served the community for over 20 years. However, a recent private survey raised questions regarding the alignment of certain boundary markers." The way she said it made the situation sound small. Technical. Temporary. Just a minor paperwork issue. But people in the room had already heard more than that. I sat quietly in the third row holding a thin folder. Inside were copies of the certified survey Thomas Green had completed, along with the county verification documents. Rebecca finished her explanation. "At this time, we believe the matter may involve a simple drafting discrepancy that will be reviewed internally." Someone near the back laughed softly. Rebecca ignored it. "We ask residents to remain patient while the board evaluates the situation." That was when I stood up. The movement drew the attention of the entire room. Rebecca's eyes immediately narrowed. "Yes, Daniel?" she said, forcing a polite tone. I walked calmly toward the front of the room and placed the folder on the table beside the microphone. "I thought it might help if everyone saw the actual survey results," I said. Without waiting for permission, I handed several copies to the residents sitting closest to the front. Papers began moving quietly through the rows. Rebecca's expression tightened. "That survey represents one interpretation." "It represents the county's boundary markers," I said calmly. Before she could respond, another person stepped forward from the side of the room. Thomas Green. He had agreed to attend after several residents requested clarification. Rebecca looked visibly uncomfortable when she saw him. Thomas spoke in the same steady tone he had used in the yard. "The original metal boundary markers placed during the subdivision development are still present and match county records," he explained. "Those markers establish the legal property lines." He gestured toward the copies of the survey now circulating through the room. "The diagram the HOA has been referencing appears to have been redrawn later without aligning those coordinates correctly." A man near the middle row raised his hand. "So the map we've been using is wrong?" Thomas nodded. "It appears to be misaligned by approximately 5 to 6 feet along several lots." The quiet murmuring returned, louder this time. Several residents leaned forward, studying the documents more carefully. One woman near the back flipped quickly through the pages. "That walking path runs through my backyard on this map," she said. Thomas glanced toward her. "Yes," he replied. "Parts of that path appear to cross private property." The room grew noticeably louder. Rebecca tried to regain control. The association acted in good faith using the information available. But the mood had already shifted. People were no longer listening politely. They were comparing the survey lines with their own property layouts. One resident stood up. "Last year I was fined for building my shed too close to the boundary." Another voice spoke from the opposite side of the room. "My fence was flagged as a violation 2 years ago." Rebecca raised her hand, trying to quiet the room. "Those matters were reviewed according to association guidelines." That was when Lydia Carter stood up. She had lived in the neighborhood longer than most of the residents in the room. A calm woman in her 60s who rarely spoke during meetings. But when she did, people listened. She held one of the survey copies in her hand. "I'd like to ask a question," she said. The room slowly quieted. Rebecca nodded stiffly. "Go ahead." Lydia looked around at the other residents before speaking again. "How many people here," she said evenly, "were fined or warned for violating boundaries based on this incorrect map?" For a moment, no one moved. Then a man near the second row raised his hand. Another followed. Then two more. A woman along the wall lifted hers slowly. More hands began appearing across the room. 1, 2, 5, 10. By the time Lydia finished turning in a slow circle, nearly a third of the room had their hands raised. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Rebecca looked out over the crowd and realized something had shifted completely. This wasn't just about one fence anymore. This was about years of enforcement decisions made using the wrong information. People weren't confused now. They were angry. And for the first time since Rebecca Langford had taken control of the HOA board, the room was no longer on her side. By the time the meeting ended that night, the tension in the room had already spilled far beyond the clubhouse walls. People didn't leave quietly. Small groups gathered in the parking lot under the streetlights, holding copies of the survey and talking in low, intense voices. Some residents walked straight back to their homes and began measuring distances in their yards with tape measures and flashlights. Others stood on sidewalks pointing toward fences, sheds, and driveways that had suddenly become questionable. The story traveled through the neighborhood faster than any official announcement ever could. Within hours, screenshots of the certified survey were circulating through the HOA community forum. Someone posted a photo of the orange survey markers still standing along the yards. Another resident uploaded a picture of the subdivision diagram the HOA had been using for years. Side by side, the difference was obvious, and people were starting to realize what it meant. By the next morning, the tone in the online forum had changed completely. Instead of discussions about landscaping rules or trash pickup schedules, the entire feed was filled with one question. How many enforcement decisions had been based on the wrong map? One homeowner wrote about being fined for installing a shed that the board said crossed a boundary line. Another said they had been forced to move a garden fence 3 years earlier after the HOA warned it was encroaching on common property. Someone else shared a letter from the association threatening daily fines over a driveway extension that supposedly crossed into HOA land. Each new post added another piece to the same growing problem. And every story pointed back to the same document, the subdivision diagram Rebecca had relied on. By midday, residents weren't just asking questions anymore. They were asking for money back. A man named Robert Langley posted a copy of a violation notice he had paid 2 years earlier along with the receipt. If the boundary was wrong, he wrote beneath the image, then this fine was never valid. Dozens of people agreed. Another homeowner asked if the HOA intended to reimburse residents who had been forced to remove structures or modify their yards. More comments followed. Some were calm, others were not. The anger didn't come from the mistake itself. Most people understood that errors happen. What angered them was the confidence the board had shown while enforcing rules based on information they had never bothered to verify. By that evening, the conversation had moved beyond the forum. Residents were knocking on each other's doors. Neighbors who had barely spoken in years were suddenly comparing property measurements and discussing past disputes with the HOA. And the one name that kept coming up in every conversation was Rebecca Langford. For years, she had run the association with strict authority. Violation notices, immediate fines, rules enforced without much discussion. But now that authority was collapsing quickly. 2 days after the meeting, another gathering was scheduled at the clubhouse. This time, it wasn't labeled an emergency discussion. It was labeled a vote. The room filled even faster than it had earlier that week. Rebecca sat at the front table again, but the atmosphere around her had changed completely. There were no polite introductions this time. No routine agenda. The residents already knew why they were there. A man near the front row stood and addressed the room. For years, this board has issued violations based on boundaries that weren't even verified, he said. We trusted those decisions because we assumed the board had done the work to confirm them. He paused for a moment before continuing. But they didn't. Several heads nodded around the room. Another homeowner spoke next. If a homeowner made a mistake like this, the HOA would fine them immediately, she said. Why should the board be treated differently? The question hung in the air. Rebecca attempted to respond, explaining again that the association had relied on the development documents provided years earlier. But the explanation no longer carried weight. People weren't interested in excuses. They were focused on accountability. Finally, Lydia Carter stood again near the center of the room. Her voice remained calm, but her words were clear. "I think it's time we decide whether the current leadership still has the confidence of this community." A quiet ripple moved through the crowd. Lydia looked toward the board table. "I would like to propose a motion to remove Rebecca Langford as HOA president." For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone near the back said, "Second." The vote was called almost immediately. Hands rose across the room. One after another. Rows of them. The decision wasn't close. When the count finished, the result was overwhelming. Rebecca Langford was no longer the president of the Homeowners Association. For the first time in years, the HOA board wasn't the authority everyone feared. They were simply another group of residents who had made a mistake, and now the entire neighborhood was watching to see how they would answer for it. A few weeks later, the neighborhood felt calm again. The tension that had filled the streets after the survey and the meeting slowly faded. Conversations returned to normal topics. Lawns were mowed, sprinklers ticked in the evenings, and kids rode their bikes along the sidewalks like nothing unusual had ever happened. But under that calm surface, several things had changed. The HOA board moved quickly to repair the damage the mistake had caused. Within days of the vote, the association hired a professional surveying firm to remap the entire subdivision properly. This time, they didn't rely on simplified development diagrams or outdated planning documents. Licensed surveyors spent nearly 2 weeks moving through the neighborhood with the same yellow instruments and orange markers Thomas Green had used in my yard. Every original boundary pin was located and verified. Every lot line was measured again. Residents watched quietly as new measurements were taken along fences, driveways, and property corners. Some homeowners discovered that their yards extended slightly farther than they had believed for years. Others learned their fences sat closer to the line than expected. But unlike before, no one rushed to accuse anyone else. The difference now was simple. The measurements were real. When the final report was finished, the association distributed updated boundary maps to every homeowner in the neighborhood. The new documents were clear, detailed, and tied directly to the verified county survey markers. There would be no more guessing. There would be no more enforcing rules based on rough diagrams. And the first example everyone quietly noticed was my fence. It remained exactly where it had been built, not 2 feet over the line. Not even close. The certified survey confirmed that every post sat safely within my property boundary, just as I had believed from the beginning. No violation, no removal, no fines, just a fence standing in the exact place it had always belonged. Rebecca Langford never attended another HOA meeting after the vote. About a week later, the board announced that she had officially resigned from her position and stepped down from all association responsibilities. No dramatic statement, no public explanation, just a quiet departure. Most residents didn't talk about her much after that. The neighborhood seemed more interested in moving forward than reliving the conflict. Mark Sullivan, however, had changed in a different way. Before the survey, he had always been quick with small talk across the driveway. Casual greetings, neighborhood gossip, occasional complaints about HOA rules. Now things were different. If we happened to step outside at the same time, he would suddenly remember something inside his house and head back through the garage door. If our paths crossed near the mailbox, he kept his eyes on the ground and walked quickly past. The survey results had revealed that the corner of his detached garage actually extended several feet onto my property line. Technically, I had every right to demand changes. But I never said a word about it. Sometimes, silence makes the point better than any argument. One afternoon, several weeks later, I found myself sitting in the backyard again, the same spot where the whole situation had started. The fence stretched across the grass in a clean, straight line, the cedar board slowly fading from fresh orange to a softer natural color under the sun. The yard was quiet. A light breeze moved through the trees beyond the property line, and somewhere down the street a lawnmower hummed faintly. I leaned back in the chair and looked along the fence posts one by one. 3 weekends of digging and measuring, 3 days of conflict, and weeks of consequences that reached far beyond one backyard. But sitting there now, the feeling wasn't victory. It wasn't anger either. Mostly, it was relief. Relief that the situation had been resolved without shouting, without threats, and without turning neighbors into permanent enemies. All it had taken was patience, and the simple decision not to panic when someone waved authority around like it was proof. The truth had been there from the beginning, buried quietly in the ground beneath a small metal survey marker that hadn't moved in over 20 years. All someone had to do was check. I looked out across the yard once more before heading inside. The fence stood solid and quiet in the afternoon sun, exactly where it belonged. Because, in the end, one simple lesson had proven itself again. Power without verification leads to mistakes, but patience, knowledge, and calm persistence will always uncover the truth. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?